This is Kim Hammer, pastor, Saline Baptist Church, community of Tull outside Benton, with your daily devotion taken from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 3, beginning with verse 12, going over into chapter 4. This is the recount that Moses is giving of when the tribes went up and conquered the east side of the river Jordan for the tribes of the Reubenites and the Gadites and half the tribe of Manasseh. And having successfully conquered that portion of the land, Moses now reminds them of the commitment that they had made earlier, that they would go over to the west side of the river Jordan and conquer that portion, which was the original boundaries that God had denoted as the promised land. But now these three tribes had to join with the rest of the tribes and go over on the west side of Jordan and defeat the inhabitants that lived in that land, so that all of the nation of Israel could have their portion of the promised land. We find that they were reminded of this in verses 18 through 20 of chapter 3, and it says that all their able-bodied men armed for war went with the other nations in order to achieve this. And so it was a commitment of brother helping brother as they went about making sure all the promised land was conquered and all the inhabitants were pushed out. In verses 21 through 28, it's the beginning of the transition of the power, the continuation of the transition of power from Moses over to Joshua. In verse 21, Joshua is reminded, he says, "You've seen all that the Lord your God has done." In the last part of the verse it says, "God will do the same for where you are going." This was not only a message spoken by Moses to Joshua, but it was a message that was spoken to all the tribes of Israel so that they could remember what God had done for them, both prior to conquering the land east of Jordan, but also conquering the land east of Jordan. And so it's a continual reminder of what God had done for them. And there's a modern day application in that. Sometimes we get so overwhelmed by the events of the world and can become so discouraged by the events of the world that we forget what God has done for us. And we need to make room and make allowances in our mind and in our hearts to remember all the good that God has done for us. Because when you look at the overall picture, God really has done so much good for us, but sometimes it's overshadowed by the presence of Satan and his efforts to wipe those things from our memory. So Moses is reminding the nation of Israel and also reminding Joshua, don't forget all the good things that God has done for you up to this point, because that will become a source of encouragement for them to go over to the west side of the Jordan and conquer that land for the remaining tribes of Israel. We find in verse 24, it says, "What God is there in heaven or on earth who can do these deeds and mighty works that you do?" And I think there's a modern day application for us. We need to ask ourselves that question from time to time. What has any other God done for us that our God has already done for us? We find that Satan is not able to do anything for us like our God is able to do for us. And so when it comes to giving our time, our attention, and our devotion, why would we want to devote more to Satan, who is a God who has never done anything for us except for hurt us, as opposed to giving our time and our attention and our talents and all of our resources to the God who has done so much for us, including saving us from an eternity in hell? In verse 25, there's one more plead by Moses to go over to the promised land. And I don't blame Moses. I mean, here he is. He's not yet in that designated area that God had originally set aside for the nation of Israel. He's gone up and helped defeat everything east of the Jordan. But now it's that opportunity to step over to what was the original promised land. And Moses is making one more plead before God. Could he go? But look at verse 26 of chapter 3. It says, it reminds us of the principle that the sins of others can cost us if we're not careful. You remember Moses struck the rock and he was provoked to anger because of what the people had done. But yet Moses had to take accountability for his actions because he lost control of himself and he struck that rock. And as a result, God said, you're not going to be allowed to enter into the promised land. It wasn't so much the fact of the action that he struck the rock as much as it was what was behind his actions of which he struck the rock. It was because he had yielded his power over to Satan and he had not allowed the power of God to shine forward in order to be able to help him as a leader lead the nation of Israel. He lost his testimony, if you would, before the people, and it cost him the opportunity to go into the promised land that God had given. Now, we find that sometimes we need to be reminded that we don't need to let others push our buttons, is the way we would say it today. Moses let the nation of Israel push his buttons, and as a result of it, he sinned grave enough that God determined that he would not be allowed to enter into the promised land here on earth. But it didn't prevent him from entering the promised land that we refer to as heaven. And then God said, don't speak to me anymore about it. The conversation was over. I'm reminded sometimes how that we as kids push our parents to the limit until finally they say, I don't want to hear about it anymore. And that's kind of where Moses was with God. God said to Moses, I don't want to hear about it anymore. And the conversation was over. And now Moses continues to turn his attention toward making sure that Joshua is recognized as the leader that God had picked to follow Moses in his steps. And we begin to take a look at what God does from this point forward. In verse 27 of chapter 3, God says, I'm not going to let you enter into the promised land, but that doesn't mean I won't let you see what's in the promised land. Now, as we use the term promised land in context of these chapters, sometimes people want to do an analogy or comparison that this is the promised land like entering into heaven. This is not the promised land like entering into heaven, because this promised land had sin in it. There's no sin in heaven. But we find that God takes Moses up to Mount Pisgah, and from the position that Moses was in, which was one of the highest mountain ranges around, Moses is going to be able to look 120 miles to the north, 120 miles to the south, 55 miles to the west, which would take it to the Mediterranean Sea, and behind him would be 10 miles to the border on the east side of the expanded promised land. And Moses had a view of being able to see into the promised land, but he was not allowed to go into it. But God did grace him in that he rewarded him, that at the end of his 120 years of living, everything that he had fought for and that he had dedicated his life to for over the last 40 plus years, God allowed him to see what the people were about to inherit. But God had something greater than the promised land here on earth to give Moses. He had the promised land in heaven, and we find that God would take him to his eternal home in heaven. He commissions Joshua, and this assured for a peaceful transition of the power. Moses saw what happened to the people when they tried to force themselves into the promised land, and that's something important to remember, that Moses was standing on the mountain looking over into the promised land, and because God had said just a few verses previously, we're done talking about it, it's not going to happen. Moses remembered the experience back 40 years earlier when the spies came back and the people said, we don't care what God says, we're going to try to go over into the promised land. And we know that they got defeated. We know that some of them got killed. Moses was not going to be that kind of leader, nor was he going to take that kind of action, because he remembered what had happened to the people previously 40 years earlier when they went in or tried to go in and the enemy ran them out. And it went against the will of God, and that's why it didn't happen. And Moses knew that, yes, he could try to come off that mountain and go over to the other side of Jordan into the originally designated land that was called the Promised Land. But he knew, number one, he'd be going against the will of God. And number two, he knew that God would not allow it to happen, because he didn't allow it to happen 40 years earlier. Why would he allow it to happen for Moses? And so we find as a result, Moses accepted that. Now that's the mark of a true leader, that he understands where he is in his relationship to God, and he doesn't go against the will of God, but instead he accepts the will of God, and he doesn't become a sore loser and try to do something that would undermine the one that was coming behind him. In this case, it was Joshua. And so Moses displayed some true leadership qualities in that he begins to give the reins over to Joshua, who would take the nation of Israel into that promised land, and it would be a successful adventure for the nation of Israel. We'll come back next time and look at some of those other qualities of Moses as we take on chapter 4.